It is 4:30 in the morning, and the City of London is still a bruised, sleeping thing. Fog rolls off the Thames in slow, deliberate waves, curling through the iron railings of Belgravia's grand terraced houses, slipping under doorways, settling into the bones of those who have no choice but to be awake. Above the street, in the highest windows of a 5-story townhouse on Eaton Square, a candle flickers to life. Not because the master of the house has risen, not because his wife has stirred beneath her silk counterpane, or his children have woken from their nursery dreams. The candle belongs to a girl named Mary. She is 14 years old. She has been awake for 3 minutes, which means she is already 2 minutes behind schedule. Mary, no surname recorded in any household ledger, no birth certificate filed in any parish record that historians have yet found, known only by the entry MH, kitchen maid, age approximately 14, wages 4 shillings per week, in the household accounts of a wealthy merchant family, pulls herself from the narrow iron cot she shares with the scullery maid, a girl 2 years her junior, whose name she has already begun to forget through sheer exhaustion. The room they sleep in is in the attic, directly beneath the roof slates, and in January, the cold is not merely uncomfortable, it is architectural. It lives in the walls. It is a feature of the space, as permanent and unquestioned as the ceiling beams above their heads. She does not have time to think about the cold. She does not have time to think about much of anything. She dresses in the dark, plain dark dress, white apron, cap, and descends. Before we go any further into Mary's world, I want to take just a moment to speak directly to you, the person watching this. Stories like Mary's, lives that were lived in silence, that were never meant to be remembered, deserve to be told with care, with research, and with the respect they were never afforded in their own time. If this kind of historical storytelling matters to you, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell. Every subscriber helps keep this community going, helps fund the research behind these narratives, and ensures that voices like Mary's, voices that history tried very hard to erase, continue to be heard. Now, let's go back. Let's follow Mary down the stairs. The staircase she descends is not the main staircase. That one sweeps in a grand mahogany curve through the center of the house, past oil portraits and Chinese vases and the kind of architectural confidence that money builds over generations. Mary uses the back stairs, narrow, uncarpeted, painted a utilitarian grey. These are the arteries of the servant's world, the hidden passages through which the labour of keeping a Victorian household alive moves invisibly, like blood through veins that the body never has to think about. This separation was not accidental. It was deliberate, ideological, and ruthlessly enforced. The Victorian middle and upper classes had developed, over the course of the 19th century, an elaborate social theology around the concept of domestic service, a theology in which servants were simultaneously indispensable and invisible. They were necessary to the functioning of civilized life, and yet their presence was considered, at best, an aesthetic inconvenience. The ideal Victorian servant was one who worked without being seen, who maintained the house without leaving evidence of the maintenance, who anticipated every need without being asked, and who, at the end of the day, disappeared entirely into the architecture of the building. It was, in the language of our own time, a form of enforced erasure, and it was experienced every single day by somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people in Victorian Britain, making domestic service the single largest category of paid employment in the country for most of the 19th century. At the peak of the Victorian era, roughly 1 in every 3 women in paid work in England and Wales was a domestic servant. 1 in 3. Mary reaches the kitchen. The kitchen of a well-appointed Victorian townhouse was, by the standards of the era, a technological marvel and a physical ordeal in almost equal measure. By the 1870s and 1880s, the introduction of the closed kitchen range, a coal-burning iron monster that replaced the old open hearth, had transformed cooking from an open flame exercise in singeing and scorching into something that more closely resembled modern stovetop cooking. This was considered a great advancement. What it actually meant in practice was that someone had to be awake before dawn to clean out the previous day's ash, relay and relight the fire, black and polish the iron surfaces of the range until they gleamed, and have the whole apparatus burning hot enough to produce hot water and breakfast for a household of 8 to 12 people by 7 o'clock. That someone was Mary. The process of cleaning and lighting the kitchen range alone took approximately 45 minutes on a good morning. First, the ash had to be raked out of the firebox and the ash pan removed and emptied, a process that produced clouds of grey dust that settled on every surface, including the lungs of the person doing it. Then the interior of the range had to be brushed clean. Then the exterior ironwork had to be rubbed with black lead, a graphite-based polish that came in a small hard block and had to be mixed with a little water and applied with a stiff brush, and then buffed to a shine with a separate brush and a soft cloth. The process turned your hands black. It produced a fine metallic dust. It was done on your knees, on a stone floor, before 5 o'clock in the morning, in near darkness, in winter temperatures that rarely climbed above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, in the unheated kitchen. Then the fire had to be laid and lit. Then the water heated. Then the flues had to be checked, because a blocked flue meant the kitchen filled with smoke, which meant the housekeeper was informed, which meant a conversation Mary preferred to avoid. Then the kettle, then the porridge, then the bread, then the trays. By the time the family upstairs was beginning to stir at 7 or 7:30, Mary had already been working for nearly 3 hours. She had not eaten. She would not eat until the family had been served, which would not be until somewhere between 8 and 8:30 at the earliest. Her breakfast, when it came, would be eaten standing up at the kitchen table, while simultaneously beginning preparations for the midday meal. It would consist of bread, dripping, and tea. If she was fortunate, there might be porridge left over. There was rarely porridge left over. This was not cruelty in the Victorian understanding of the term. This was just the way things were. The household manuals that proliferated in the mid to late Victorian era, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management being the most famous and widely consulted, published in 1861, presented the running of a domestic establishment as a matter of precise military organisation, with the mistress of the house as its commanding general and the servants as its disciplined troops. Isabella Beeton, who wrote her famous manual at the age of 21 and died at 28, never claimed to be describing anything other than the world as she found it. She was cataloguing a system, not inventing one. And the system, when you looked at it clearly, was one in which the physical comfort and personal dignity of the servant class had been completely subordinated to the smooth operation of the employer's household. The hours speak for themselves. The workday of a typical Victorian domestic servant, as documented in household records, servant memoirs, and the testimony gathered by parliamentary investigators during the various reform inquiries of the later 19th century, commonly began between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning and ended between 9 and 10 o'clock at night. That is a working day of between 16 and 18 hours. For this, a kitchen maid in the 1870s could expect to earn somewhere between 4 and 6 shillings per week, the equivalent, in rough purchasing power, of perhaps 30 to 40 pounds in today's money. A housemaid earned slightly more. A cook, if she had experience and a good character reference, might earn as much as 20 to 30 pounds per year, a figure that sounds, until you calculate it against the hours and the conditions, entirely inadequate. They had no employment contracts. They had no legal right to a minimum wage. They had no right to sick pay, no right to holidays, no protection against arbitrary dismissal, and, crucially, no legal mechanism through which to complain about working conditions or employer misconduct. What they had instead was the character reference. The Victorian character reference was, in the servants' world, the closest thing to a legal document they possessed. Without a written reference from a previous employer testifying to the servant's honesty, sobriety, cleanliness, diligence, and moral respectability, finding a new position was nearly impossible. No reputable household would take on a servant who could not produce their character. This created a situation of dependency so complete, so structurally total, that it is difficult, from our vantage point, to fully comprehend. Consider what it meant in practice. If a servant was dismissed, for any reason, or for no stated reason at all, since employers were not required to explain their decisions, their ability to find future employment depended entirely on whether their former employer was willing to write them a favorable reference. An employer who bore a servant a grudge, or who had dismissed them for reasons they preferred not to commit to paper, or who simply could not be bothered to write the thing, held, in the absence of that document, the power to render that servant unemployable. And unemployable, in the Victorian context, meant something far more dire than it does today. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no social safety net in any meaningful modern sense. The workhouse was the alternative, and the workhouse was, by design, a place of deliberate degradation and misery, a deterrent, not a refuge. This is why the stories of servant dismissal that appear in Victorian memoirs, court records, and newspaper accounts so often read as catastrophic, life-altering events, rather than merely the inconvenience they might appear to a modern reader. To lose your position without a character was not simply to lose your job. It was, potentially, to lose your future. Hannah Culwick, one of the very few Victorian servants who left behind an extensive personal record. She kept a diary at the instruction of her partner, the barrister and writer Arthur Munby, from the 1850s onwards, describes this vulnerability with a plainness that is more devastating than any rhetorical flourish. She wrote that without her character, she was nothing, that a person could be strong and willing and honest and clean, and have it count for nothing if they could not prove it on paper to a stranger. Hannah was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary woman, physically powerful, intellectually curious, emotionally clear-sighted, working as a maid of all work in a series of London households, carrying coal scuttles that weighed more than she did, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees for hours at a time, blacking boots, hauling water, cleaning grates. She described her work in detail that is sometimes almost impossible to read, not because it is sensational, but because it is so methodical, so matter-of-fact, so devoid of complaint. She had no category for complaint. Complaint was not something her world offered her. It is worth pausing here and sitting with that for a moment. Hannah Culwick had no category for complaint, not because she was broken or passive or unaware of her situation. She was none of those things. She was one of the most self-aware and perceptive voices we have from the Victorian working class. She had no category for complaint because the entire social, legal, and economic structure around her had been designed to ensure that servant voices were not heard, not recorded, and not taken seriously. She was living, as were all Victorian servants, inside a system that had been constructed with one purpose: to serve the comfort of those who employed her, at whatever cost to herself. Not all servants occupied the same position in this world. Victorian domestic service had its own elaborate internal hierarchy, a stratified social order that mirrored, in miniature, the class structure of the society it served. At the top of the servant hierarchy, in a large household, sat the butler, invariably male, responsible for the household silver, the wine cellar, the male staff, and the formal presentation of the house to the outside world. He wore a tailcoat. He dined separately from the other servants at the head of the servants' table. He was, within his domain, a figure of considerable authority and sometimes considerable personal dignity. Below the butler sat the housekeeper, the female counterpart to his authority, responsible for the female staff, the linen, the china, the daily running of the household's domestic operations. The housekeeper occupied a peculiar social position, superior to the other female servants. She was nonetheless still a servant, dependent on her employer's goodwill for her position and her home. She typically had her own sitting room, a small private space that was one of the very few amenities of domestic service. She was addressed as Mrs., as a courtesy title, regardless of her actual marital status. A practice that acknowledged her status within the household while simultaneously underlining the artificiality of that status. The cook was the third great pillar of the upstairs servant hierarchy, a skilled professional whose expertise was genuinely valued and who occupied a position somewhere between artisan and employee. A good cook was actively courted by employers, and a really exceptional cook, one who could produce a proper French dinner of 6 or 7 courses, who understood sauces, who could manage a kitchen with staff and produce food for dinner parties of 20 or 30, commanded serious wages and a degree of bargaining power that most other servants simply did not possess. There are records of Victorian cooks who negotiated their own perks: the right to sell leftover dripping, or the kitchen fat, or the bones. Small economies that could add meaningfully to their annual income. These were not trivial negotiations. They took place within a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of worker agency, and the fact that they happened at all is a small, stubborn testament to human resourcefulness. Below these 3 central figures descended a long staircase of increasingly marginal positions. The lady's maid, a specialist who dressed her mistress, maintained her wardrobe, accompanied her on journeys, and served as a kind of personal attendant and confidant. The footman, young, tall, height was a genuine employment criterion for footmen because they looked better in livery. Responsible for answering the door, waiting at table, and performing a miscellany of tasks that combined physical labor with the theatrical display of household grandeur. The housemaid, she who cleaned, dusted, swept, polished, laid fires, made beds, carried water, and performed the vast invisible maintenance that kept the upper floors of the house habitable. The kitchen maid, she who assisted the cook, prepared vegetables, cleaned the kitchen, and existed in a state of near-permanent motion between the kitchen and the scullery. And at the very bottom, doing the most physical, the least skilled, and the most unpleasant work of all, the scullery maid. The scullery maid washed the dishes, all of them, in cold water, with soda crystals that cracked and dried and bled the skin of her hands until, by the end of a single day's work, those hands were raw, chapped, and bleeding at the knuckles. She scoured the pots and pans. She scrubbed the scullery floor. She cleaned the kitchen sink. She did what nobody else would do in a small, damp, stone-floored room at the back of the kitchen. And she did it from first light to last. And she earned, for this, between 2 and 4 shillings per week. She was often the youngest person in the house. She was often the most recently arrived from the countryside, bewildered and homesick and with no one to ask for help. It is her hands I keep coming back to. The scullery maid's hands, the soda water and the cold, the way the Victorian households comfort, the gleaming dinner service, the perfectly polished silverware, the sparkling crystal glasses on the dining table upstairs, was underwritten at its most fundamental level by the destroyed skin of a child's hands in a basement room. The rules that governed servant life varied from household to household, but certain conventions were so widely observed as to constitute a kind of unofficial code. Servants were generally not permitted to use the front door of the house. They entered and exited through the basement or rear entrance, a physical enactment of their social position. Servants were not to be seen or heard by visitors, and were expected to flatten themselves against the wall or disappear into an adjacent room if a member of the family appeared unexpectedly. Servants were not to speak unless spoken to, and were certainly not to initiate conversation with family members or their guests. Servants were not to receive personal visitors at the house without permission, and this permission was rarely granted in a form that amounted to anything practical. Servants were typically not permitted followers, the Victorian term for romantic partners or admirers. A servant discovered to have a follower risked immediate dismissal. This rule was enforced with particular rigour against female servants, for reasons that had everything to do with the Victorian middle class's anxieties about female sexuality and respectable household order. A housemaid who became pregnant, by anyone, including, as was grimly common, by a male member of the employing household, was dismissed instantly and without a character reference, leaving her in the most desperate of circumstances. The cruelty of this logic was not lost on contemporary observers, even if it was almost never acted upon. The woman who had been victimized was the one who paid the price, while the man who had victimized her typically faced no consequences whatsoever.